Okay. So my next question would be: Do you know? Did you recognize any specific constraints for the development of Proptech in Europe? Like, do you believe that there should be some kind of European dimension for the Proptech market? Some European bonds that links all the companies. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, there is. Let's start with that last point. In Europe, there already is a sort of a European association called Proptech House, which, you know, there is an opportunity there for companies to come together, and especially from an EU funding perspective, have some input. But you know, speaking frankly about the market, there are only three things which I feel stop a market growing. And I call them the three L's. Number one is a language problem. Number two is a liberty problem. And number three is a legislative problem. So let me start with the language problem. With Europe, it has so many countries speaking so many different languages. Quite often, when we've got the Proptech companies starting early, they think about their domestic market. So everything in your case would be in Italian for an Italian market. And from a language perspective, there is a restriction going as a product in an Italian market. And then actually as a team with English as a second language, it's not as easy to expand. So the language is definitely a constraint. It will stop expansion. The second one is almost the two are the same, liberties and legislation. We're seeing many more barriers put up around personal liberties of people, around data, both commercially and residentially, and what we as individuals are able to give away, which then constrains the power of individual companies. And those sort of liberties that we have differ in Europe from whether you're in France or Germany or the UK or Italy. So our personal perspectives are going to constrain growth for certain countries, certain companies. And the last one is legislative problems. If you're in the residential sector, for example, the difference between an Italian residential legislative contract compared to a German is massively different. And as a consequence, you really have to think about your Proptech company from a legislative standpoint at the start of your journey to say, well, which markets are very similar to ours, language, liberty, and legislation-wise. And you have to think about it from that, because you are going to have a problem if you don't think that through at the start.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's really interesting, because I think that, I mean, the real estate market in general is very local. Like, I think typically there are a lot of very local dimensions, and traditionally real estate operators can't be too globalized in a way, in the sense that, yes, maybe they are global companies, but then they always have their very local people on the territory that work there, and that cannot be too, I mean, moving too much around. They need to be very specific, very specialized into a specific sector. And on the other side, there is technology, which is instead something that you theoretically can apply everywhere. And so I think that Proptech kind of keeps together this dichotomy, which is pretty funny.
It does, but remember that the asset class is homogenous. A building in Milan or Rome is going to be very much the same as a building in London or Sydney. So the asset that we're dealing with is homogenous. It's just everything that goes behind that, which is going to be that challenge. So that's why, again, we talk about Proptech being a global solution for the local problem. You've just got to jump through language, liberties, legislation as three core areas.
Yeah. I totally agree. One additional difficulty here in Italy is that most of the time we don't have a national legislation. We have so many regions that have, and so many cities and municipalities that sometimes have their own teeny tiny rules that, of course, are expressed in the national language. And so it's really sometimes a little bit of a wild forest that people need to navigate. But
and that's the same in the US. But in the US, obviously, a state is as big as many countries. So they almost have that domestic market on a federal level, which is okay. In Italy, it's not. It's totally different.
Yeah, totally. So do you see any like major differences between Europe compared to the American, meaning Northern American and or all America and Asian markets? Are there something that is typical of a specific Proptech market in these different continents?
It's a really interesting question, and it's not something I've really thought about too much. The one thing I will say is, and this is a very general perspective, if we're classifying it on a continent level, the North American market is obviously considerable, 2,000 plus companies. Europe actually is a very similar marketplace, about 2,000 companies. The Asian market is a lot smaller. It's circa 900 to 1,000 companies, and that brings in China, India into that mix as well. So the first thing I'll say, the difference is the size. I would also say over the last 3 or 4 years, there has been a big movement from the money markets out of America, in the sense that the venture capital market was a bit of a bubble in America, where young companies were getting very large valuations just because they were a Proptech company. We now see that shift over to sustainability and ESG, by the way, where you're getting very large valuations because the domestic money market is very strong. So we started to see a lot of movement away, obviously not all money, but there was a lot of movement of money from American venture firms and private equity firms into the European and the Asian markets, where valuations were a lot lower for comparable companies. I think that's going to continue. I think that will be a trend that we will see continue. But I don't think we should just say America, Europe, Asia. We're also forgetting 2 very considerable continents in South America and Africa. And I have a prediction that over the next 5 to 10 years, you will see an awful lot of activity coming out of South America and Africa, because they are considerable real estate markets, but the technology markets are very small. And if there's one thing that this recent pandemic has done, it's meant that the mentality shift in developing nations is accelerating to a technological adoption, and there is great value in those nations.
Yeah, definitely an exciting perspective. So let's talk about Italy now. So for what you have observed, how is Italy progressing? Have you seen maybe more companies emerging lately from our country, also in terms of popularity? There are some companies that we invited to this seminar, this webinar. I don't know how to define it. Casavo, Habit, Italian Way, and Sofia Locks, that are actually some of the most visible of our Proptech companies.
Absolutely.
Have you heard about them? Like, how do they look compared to other similar companies around the world?
Sure. I mean, take 2 of those that you mentioned. So Casavo obviously has raised the most amount of money in Italy. So it is obviously one of the largest companies to come out. And their particular market around iBuyers is very exciting. It gets a lot of investment. It needs a lot of investment. So companies like that are really flying the flag. Sofia Locks, again, that smart access of getting into the residential and the commercial buildings. There is a direction of travel, which means companies like them will progress very well. And Sofia are a classic example of what I said earlier, which is there is a domestic market which is good, and they will do very well here. But from what I know of Sofia, they're already looking at that expansion. How do we export the hardware that we have into other markets? So they're a classic example of, let's go into Germany, let's go and expand our market. So talking on a micro level, there are some great companies out of Italy, and I expect a lot more over the sort of the coming again 2 to 5 year timetable. But what I'm going to do, if you don't mind, I'm actually just going to rather than give you my qualitative opinion, what I always like to do, obviously, is talk to you about real data. So I'm actually going to give you some of the live data that we actually worked on. So can you see my screen again?
Yes.
Okay, so this is some of the analytics that actually you and I have worked on, Chiara, in terms of actually understanding the Proptech companies which are out there at the moment in Italy. So, we're currently analyzing, there was 123 companies, of which 5 are no longer active. So there's actually 118 companies which are active. And you can see here quite clearly that there has been a trend in the last sort of 5 or 6 years where the peak sort of setting up of companies has happened. And, this year, 2020, we saw 3 companies which started. So, quite a drop off of that peak period.
Yeah.
But what's interesting when you break it down is there's definitely more of a commercial feel to all of this. And if I break it down in terms of the sort of the job functions and things like that, that's sort of what I would call the functional Proptech around asset management, document management is definitely prevalent. But as is the trend all over the world, the manage phase of the building life cycle is always the most popular. So Italy is no different to anyone else. And I'm happy to share some of these figures with you. But that's the sort of the current state when it comes to the number of Proptechs which are here. But what also tells a story, I think, around a market and how it's developing is the funding, because it tells you how mature that market's coming. So if you look at the last few years, and you've got obviously sort of the peak investment was back in 2019, and then actually 2021, which is looking to be a record year around the world for investment. You're not far off that with a few months to go in terms of the total funding. But what's also interesting here is looking at that sort of average funding level. So the average funding coming from these companies is relatively static. And one trend that I'm seeing everywhere else, but it's not here, is that generally this sort of average and median funding is a lot higher this year than it has been before. You're not really quite there yet. And I also see the number of funding events dropping off quite considerably in other markets. And your funding events are quite static and stable year on year, which means I think there's still a long way to go in the Italian market when it comes to investment. And what I would say is that when I talk about the data about other global markets, I'm saying the market is maturing. There's a lot more mature companies coming in. They've proven their business models and investors are backing them. What I'm starting to see in Italy is the market's just not big enough yet. It's not there yet. It certainly hasn't reached the peak maturity. So there's still an awful lot of room in there for the Italian market to have some homegrown technology entrepreneurs to really make a move in this market.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you for this very interesting data. Perhaps we can still chat about the numbers, because we had recent updates, and so it's probably time for us to have another exchange, because I see our number is not quite aligned with yours anymore. But
let's get it up. Let's get more. That's what we want.
Yes, exactly.
We want more. We want more. But Chiara, that's important, and I tell you why. Because if there's more companies, it means the ecosystem is growing.
Yeah.
And it's so important, because there are some markets that we are now in where the numbers don't really change. And what I'm talking about with the Italian market, again, is your market is really starting to go. And that means that the numbers of Proptech companies will always change and shift. And it's important we keep that data going so that, yourselves and actually your domestic market realizes they're on the crest of a wave of real developments happening. So let's get those numbers updated.
Definitely. Yeah, sure. But I'm observing really a growth and also a transition from companies that are maybe more in the fintech and insurtech areas that are trying to kind of move to the real estate area and the Proptech market. So for sure, there is also this kind of expansion of interests and action from other similar technological companies that are trying to see what are the opportunities in Proptech. So I totally agree with you with the need for Italy to encourage more and more Proptech initiatives and Proptech companies to be founded. So I think we are at the end of our interesting interview or conversation, I would say, more or less, because questions that came on both sides from both sides. So I would say in general, can you just conclude with a few remarks on the future perspectives of Proptech, but more specifically of Unissu also? What is your role? How you imagine Unissu in the next few years?
Yeah, of course. So to conclude, more importantly, about your market in Italy, I remember I was standing on a stage in Sydney 4 years ago, and I was the MC of a large conference, and there was about 400 people there. And I said, I have seen the feeling that I'm getting in Australia about 4 years ago in the United Kingdom. And I said to them that I'm really excited for you because I know that the Australian market is about to take off. And I have a feeling that you will see in 2 or 3 years' time, you will set up an association and there'll be an awful lot of really exciting new companies that develop, lots of new investment that come into the country, both from Australian venture capitalists and VCs from outside investing in Australia. And I said, I think this is going to be a really exciting 4 or 5 years period. If I look back on that now, I would say exactly the same thing to you, Chiara, and your audience, which is Italy, just looking at the data, not my opinion, but looking at the data, you're at the same space that Australia was 3 or 4 years ago. And I think you're about to hit a really interesting time where both the technology entrepreneurs and the property industry wake up and see all of the other things happening around the world and realize we need to do something like that in Italy. So I am really excited for you, and in particular, Chiara, just for you, because I know that you've been the sort of the person leading that charge. So I think there's a really exciting 2 or 3 years ahead for you, the organization, and the university. With regard to Unissu, as far as I'm concerned, we are that destination for that globalization of the digital transformation of the real estate industry. And genuinely, if we can be of any help, obviously to you, Chiara, and your organization, and also for all of the people in Italy to help you as a business. So whether you're a Cassavo, or whether you're a Habit, or whether you're a Sofia, or whether you're an individual who's just looking to learn, we want to try and support you if we can. So very happy.
James, how can I say thanks for all your interesting insights, for your encouragement, for your enthusiasm in this. That is really, really contagious, let's say, even if contagion is not a very good word.
No.
Right. It's okay. It's a metaphorical.
It is. We'll do that.
Okay. So thank you very much. I'm sure that we'll see each other again soon. And of course, I strongly believe in your organization, and I think that this can really bring a lot of value and help and support, concrete support to all our smaller nations that are moving a little bit late compared to others, but that are very passionate and powerful. And I think that we'll make it, and we'll meet again and redo this interview in 4 years.
In Milan. I will come to Milan and we'll enjoy a coffee in Milan.